parents teach their children about the dangers in life. You've been taught as a child, and if you're a parent, you taught your child. Don't touch a hot stove. Don't be careful when you get a sharp knife. And don't play with matches. You ever heard all of those things? And eventually it gets around to people. They will tell their children, don't or beware of strangers. Don't get in a car with a stranger. Now that's interesting to me because the book of Proverbs picks up that theme and it applies it to people. Now you have to remember that Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs and he wrote it to his son. There are a couple of chapters that are written by somebody else, but most of it's written by Solomon. And in the preface he tells us it's written to his son. And then there are proverbs in that book that talk about friendship. And some of them say, don't be friends with a certain kind of person. And it names the kind of person you should not be friends with. Now, when you hear that as a parent, you think, well, that makes sense. But in the context of the Bible, that might strike you as strange. I mean, doesn't the Bible tell us to love everybody? Doesn't it tell us to even love your enemies? So maybe this little subject needs some clarification before we dig into its depths. What I have often said to people, especially teenagers, is this. It is one thing to be friendly. It's another thing to have a close friend. And the one thing you need to know is this. There is a line in a relationship. And that line is crossed when that relationship begins to affect you negatively more than it affects you positively. That's the issue, especially for young people. So if you have a relationship and it's benefiting you positively, iron sharpens iron, the book of Proverbs tells us, that's great. But if that relationship is affecting you negatively, even either in your attitude or your actions, then is when you have to draw the line. So you can love your enemies, you just need to avoid certain people. You can love them, which in the Greek sense of the term means to do what's best for them, but that doesn't mean that you have to have them as your close, intimate friend. And that's the issue. And even beyond that, are they influencing you for good or for evil? So it's one thing to love everybody. It's another thing to be friends with some people. And the issue is influence, in my opinion. I know of a mother who used to tell her children when they were young, be friendly with everybody, but choose your friends carefully. So with that clarification, I want to look at what the book of Proverbs says about don't be friends with. And it goes for children, it goes for teenagers, and it goes for adults. And Solomon tells us why he says that. So with that in mind, I want to look at 4 types of people with whom you should not be close friends. You can be friendly, just don't be close friends with them, especially if they influence you negatively. So with that in mind, let's start with Proverbs 14:7. Proverbs 14:7. There are 2 proverbs under this category, and that's the first one. It says, go from the presence of a foolish man when you do not perceive in him the lips of knowledge. So the first category is don't be friends with a fool. As a matter of fact, Solomon states it, go from the presence of a foolish man. There's also Proverbs 13:20, which says, he who walks with a wise man will be wise, but the companion of fools will be destroyed. So I think both of these proverbs are saying very clearly, avoid fools, or at least don't walk with them. Don't live with them. Don't make them your close friends. So Proverbs 14:7 says, go from their presence. Do not go with them when you perceive that when you perceive in him the lips of knowledge is not there. So don't stick around to be influenced by him or her. They cannot offer you anything of value. So that's not to be your companion. Concerning Proverbs 13:20, one commentator said, to walk with the person implies love and attachment, and it is impossible not to imitate those we love. So we say, show me his companions, and I will tell you the man. Let me know the company he keeps, and I shall easily guess his moral character. A man is known by the company he keeps. Solomon would say, it's just not that you're known by the company you keep, you become like the company you keep. So, don't become close friends with a fool. Now, in this series on Proverbs, I spent several messages talking about fools and pointed out that in English we would simply say a fool is somebody who's stupid. So it might not be that they're doing something that's morally wrong, it's that they're just stupid. Is that blunt enough? Many years ago, when I was much younger, as a matter of fact, when I first started out in the ministry, I spent a lot of time with teenagers. I was a youth pastor once, and when I began to travel, I spoke at a lot of youth camps. And I had matter of fact, I dealt with some Proverbs even way back in those days, which was many decades ago. But I remember I had an illustration. I haven't told this story in years, but this is the way I would communicate to teenagers about being friends with a fool. And this is the way I did it. Let's imagine that there was a man who had a mansion on the top of a mountain. And the only way to get there was by stagecoach. And at one point on the trip up the mountain, there was a winding road. And at one point in that winding road, it was narrow and there was plenty of room for a stagecoach to get by. But on the right side of that road, going up the mountain, there was a precipice. And if that stagecoach fell off that precipice, it would kill everybody aboard. On the other side of that small road was a wall of rock. So the man that had the house on the top of the mountain needed a stagecoach driver. So he applied, put an ad in the paper, and 3 people responded. The first one got to that point and he thought, well, I have to demonstrate that to this owner that I can handle this. So he drove within a foot of the edge. Well, the other 2 saw that, and when it came the time for the second one to try out, he thought, well, I got to do better than that. I mean, if he could drive within a foot, I've got to demonstrate that I can handle these horses. So he drove within 6 inches of that precipice. The third one said, I don't need this job that bad. And when he got to that place in the road, he turned those horses so that he hugged the wall of the rock. And then I said to the teenagers, if you were the man on the top of the mountain, which one of those stagecoach drivers would you hire? And obviously, you would want the one that was going to be safe, right? Well, the guy that's driving the stagecoach too close to the edge of that precipice is a fool. He's stupid. You just don't do that. You don't know what's going to happen to that team of horses. So you hug that wall of rock. And that's what I think the book of Proverbs is saying. In terms of friendship, You don't be close friends with a fool. 14:7 says, go from his presence if there's not wisdom on his lips. And 13:20 says, if you walk with a wise man, you'll be wise. But if you walk with a fool, you will be destroyed. So you get friends with somebody that takes the risk of driving too close to that precipice, and you could be destroyed. So the first category of people with whom you should not be friends is fool. There is a second. Look at Proverbs 22:24. Proverbs 22:24 says, make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go, lest you learn his ways and set a snare for your soul. Interesting. Do not make friends. Don't let your close friends be someone who is angry. And then he says, and with a furious man, do not go. So he talks about anger, and then he talks about somebody who's furious. These Hebrew words have interesting little nuances and word pictures behind them. Anger comes from the nose, and it pictures rapid breathing of a passionate person. The word that's translated furious comes from a Hebrew word that means hot, burning, anger, rage. I think if I were going to pick an English word that might describe this fellow, I'd say he's a hothead. And there are people like that, and you don't want to be friends with them. They have outbursts of anger. They're hotheads. And he says, oh, look at the passage. You will learn his ways. If you hang around him, you will learn his ways. And when you do, it will be a snare for your soul. To say it simply, bad company is bad business, because it could end up harming you. Now, there are two things going on here. One is you will learn his ways. Sin is contagious. It never loses its infectious character. So associating with an angry, furious person is like living in a house that's on fire. One fire kindles another, and you are liable to get burned. The other thing this passage is saying is not only will you learn his ways, he will set a snare for your soul. So those are two different things. And the idea of that second idea, that you'll be caught up with the snare, is that you'll be caught up in a situation that will be hard to get out of. That once you have a relationship with that person, you learn his ways, and you're going to be caught in a situation that will be hard to get out of. Now, I am aware that most people I'm speaking to concerning all of this are adults. There are a few teenagers listening, but I want to talk about single people. If you are single, especially if you are a girl, let me apply this proverb and this principle directly to you. If you are dating an angry person, do not marry him. Now, to be fair, if you are dating an angry girl, do not marry her. So that knife slices both ways. But I know what happens. I've seen it happen. You think, well, he'll change. She'll change. That's what they think. I think this is a red flag. That if you are thinking about marrying an angry person, don't. It's as simple as that. And this proverb says, why? Because you'll learn his ways. Or you'll be caught in a trap. You'll be caught in a snare. I know of an illustration. I know of a case like that. There was a young man who was dating a girl, and in this case, she was angry. She was angry at her father. And someone told him before they got married, you should think about this. She's a wonderful girl. She comes across well, but underneath all that veneer, she's an angry person. So be careful. He married her anyway. Years later, I understand that her anger affected her husband's relationship with his family, so that it got so bad he could not have a relationship with his own mother because of the anger of his wife. He would only talk to his mother on the phone when his wife wasn't around. Now that's the kind of snare you cannot get out of. So Solomon says, don't have that kind of a close friend. And I think certainly that would apply to marriage. So think about this carefully before you marry an angry person. Now, let me put in a disclaimer. Everybody gets angry, right? I'm not talking about people who get angry. I'm talking about people who are angry. And there is a difference. Everybody gets frustrated and gets a little angry once in a while, but you know the difference when they're angry all the time and the least thing shoots them off, and they're hotheads. There's a huge difference. That's the kind of person these Proverbs are talking about. All right. So far we've looked at fools and we've looked at angry people. There's a third category. Now, when I went through the book of Proverbs and I laid out all the topics and I came to the subject of friendship, I saw that, wow, there's a lot in this book about friendship. So I divided them into two parts. And as you know, the last time we looked at part 1, and this is part 2. What I found interesting was that in part 2, all these proverbs about don't be friends with some people, most of those proverbs in that category fell under the classification of one type of person. And that is the next category. Not just a fool, not just angry, but a sinner. I want you to turn in your Bible to Proverbs chapter 1. I'm going to go through this passage. Back in those days when I was traveling and in the summer got invited to youth camps, I did a series in Proverbs for teenagers. And I was intrigued by Proverbs chapter 1. Matter of fact, I would spend a whole week speaking on Proverbs, just chapter 1. Now, what I want you to turn to that passage, and I want to just show you, I think this is, talk about insight and wisdom. Look at this passage. The first 6 verses are the prologue, the introduction to the book of Proverbs. So I'm going to skip that for a second. Now look at verse 7. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, as you've heard me say, the word wisdom, the word knowledge in the book of Proverbs overlaps wisdom. Matter of fact, in chapter 9, he says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But what I want you to notice about verse 7 is he's talking about your relationship with the Lord, right? So the first 6 verses of chapter 1 are an introduction. The first thing he says is, you want wisdom? That comes from a relationship with the Lord. Now look at verse 8. He says, my son, hear the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the law of your mother. You want wisdom? Then listen to the Lord And the second most important thing I could possibly tell you is listen to your parents. Now, I know when you're a young person, you think you know more than your parents at some point. But if you want wisdom, they happen to have lived a little longer than you. They may have a little insight that you don't have. So here's what Solomon says to his son. Look at verse 8. My son, hear the instruction of your father. Now, hear doesn't mean that you just hear what he says. It means heed what he says. So hear what your father says, and do not forsake the law of your mother. Now, I've already commented on verse 8 in this series. I think it's one of the most interesting verses. Mother has laws. Oh, yeah. God has laws. Government has laws. Mother has laws. So he's not saying obey the law of God. He's saying obey the law of mother. Because whatever her law is, you will learn from that obedience. But what I want you to see is the very first thing he says after the introduction is make sure you have a right relationship with the Lord, and then listen to your parents. What's third? If you were going to talk to your children, if you were going to talk to your son, especially if he were a teenager or a young man, how would you list the priorities? Would you put the Lord first? Sure. Put parents second? Of course. What's third? Look at verse 10. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait to shed blood. Let us lurk secretly for the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them alive like Sheol. That's a reference to the grave. And whole, like those who go down to the pit. Another reference to the grave. We shall find all kinds of precious possessions. We shall fill our houses with spoils. Cast in your lot among us. Let us all have one purse. Now, I find it just fascinating that the book of Proverbs opens with, this is a book of wisdom. I'm going to give you some wisdom. You ready? Make sure you have a right relationship with the Lord. Make sure you have a right relationship with your parents. And next, be care of a sinner. Matter of fact, he just flat out says, if sinners entice you, do not consent. Be careful, my son. Be careful, young people. Be careful, anybody. Don't be close friends with sinners. Now, in this case, it's pretty dramatic. He says, for example, we're going to shed blood. He says, we shall find all kinds of precious possessions. In other words, this is a murderous plot of robbery. Then this ends in verse 14, says, come, cast your lot among us. Let us all have one purse. Now, this is what's critical. And this is what I'm convinced gets young people. Matter of fact, I think it's worse today than at any time I've ever seen it. And that is, when young people get that age, their peers have more influence over them often than their parents. So the motivation is, now look at verse 14, cast your lot among us. So that the idea is, the motivation is belong. And that's what I'm convinced gets them. Matter of fact, I've heard people say that there are gangs in the city and that the appeal is just that, belonging. That in some cases they don't have a traditional family and their family becomes the gang. At any rate, that's clearly what's going on here in verse 14. So wanting to belong is not wrong. I'm not suggesting that it's wrong. It's a natural motive. The Lord built us that way. It's natural. It's a God-given instinct. I'm just saying you need to belong to the right group. You need to belong to the group that's beneficial. The problem is that some associate with a group that's detrimental, which is what he's talking about here. So he says in verse 10, if sinners entice you, don't consent. He says in verse 15, my son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your feet from their path. In other words, don't even associate with them, much less be their friends. Just don't go that way. Have no dealings with them whatsoever. Now, I can imagine somebody hearing this and saying, well, now, wait a minute. Wasn't Jesus the friend of sinners? Yes, he was. I mean, didn't he eat with publicans and sinners? Yes, he did. But remember what I said at the introduction. The issue is, are you influencing them or are they influencing you? Jesus could eat with sinners, and some Christians can do that because they're strong enough. But when you're young, when you're a young teenager, and in many cases when you're an older teenager, or even a young man, be careful, because the line of demarcation is when they start influencing you. But if they just say up front, come be part of us and let's sin together, then you know, do not consent. So, he goes on in this passage to give reasons for that. Look at verse 16. For their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. In verse 17 he says, surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird, and they lie in wait for their own blood. They lurk secretly for their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who is greedy for gain, to take away the life of its owner. Now in those verses, in 16 to 19, he's giving basically two reasons why you should not become friends with a group of people who are sinners. One is because it's wrong. He says in verse 16, their feet run to evil. So the minute a companion gets to the line of evil, then that's the clue. Exit stage right. And the other is, it's just not wise. For he goes on to say, they lurk secretly for their own lives. Once you get involved with a group of people and they're bent on sin, it's going to end up in your destruction, not just theirs or the people thereafter. So, he gives reasons for not doing this. They lay in wait for their own blood. This is to your own destruction. There's a modern proverb that says, what goes around comes around. So if you go after sin, just remember, sin eventually leads to self-destruction. And self-destruction is just not smart. So, if you're going to analyze this, you would say something like, first there's the invitation that seems harmless. They simply say, come with us. That's in verse 11. Later it gets serious. It says, cast your lot with us. That's verse 14. The lure is compelling. All of us want to belong to something. The group appeal is a strong attraction. And then you discover that when they said, just come with us, or cast your lot with us, that they have evil intent. And when that's the case, it will lead to your destruction. You become a partner in crime with them. So, the first category is sinner. The minute you see a group, and the issue is sin, that's the clue. Get out, and get out quick. You know, I was scratching my head. Has anything like this ever happened to me? And I remembered something I'd forgotten about. Yeah, it did. It did. When I was a teenager. and before I became a Christian. I'm going to date myself. Sears and Roebuck, who later became Sears, had a little thing called a motor scooter. Do you remember those little red motor scooters? It wasn't a motorcycle, it was a little motor scooter. Well, my first excursion into transportation beyond a pair of skates and a bicycle was I bought a motor scooter. And I had a buddy who had a motor scooter. So we went for a ride together way out in the country, and we stopped at this little country store. And I remember when we got out of there, he was so proud of the fact that he had done some shoplifting. And I was horrified. I never rode with him again. I think I was just terrified that I would get caught stealing. Now that is the kind of thing I think this passage is talking about. I didn't have any idea he would do such a thing. But the minute I found out, I thought, I don't want to go there. So this is sin. In this case, it's murder and robbery. They wait for their blood. So when that happens, I'm out of here. Now, there are other Proverbs that talk about it. In fact, there are several. Look at Proverbs 16:29. A violent man entices his neighbor and leads him in the way that is not good. Now, this is another case of a sinner. A violent man is not content to sin by himself. He wants to lead others down that road. So he says a violent man entices his neighbor. So he wants to sin, and it's violence, but he's not satisfied to do that by himself. He entices his neighbor and leads him in the way that is not good, which we've just discussed. In other words, it's destructive. Don't go there. Or look at Proverbs 23:20. Do not mix with wine-bibbers or with gluttonous eaters of meat, for the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe a man with rags. Now, this is an interesting little proverb. Don't associate with somebody who drinks too much. And for that matter, he says, don't make a close friend out of somebody that eats too much. Do not keep company with those who drink too much or eat too much, because, he says in these verses, drunkenness and gluttony leads to drowsiness and poverty. I must say, again, these are proverbs, not laws. I remember years ago when I first saw this proverb, there was a fellow named Jackie Gleason. How many of you remember Jackie Gleason? Remember Jackie? Well, he violated this proverb. And he wasn't in poverty. And I remember thinking, ooh, does that mean this proverb's not true? No, it means this proverb is a proverb. And as you've heard me say in this series, these are general principles. There are exceptions. But as a rule, people who are drunks and gluttons will lead to drowsiness. Thanksgiving's coming. You know, it's like to eat this big Thanksgiving dinner. What do you feel like after that? Like a nap for 2 days, you know? Right, there's drowsiness. And in the case of drunkenness, there you end up in poverty. I mean, just go down to Skid Row and see how many people are on booze and drugs. And they're in poverty. I associated once with a homeless man. I took a walk through a park, and he was sitting there every day, and I became friends with him. And he was a business owner. He owned a business, but he had a problem with drinking. And when I met him, he was homeless. He had nothing. He eventually got off the street. I would like to think I had a little part in that. But my point is, his drinking brought him to poverty. And that's exactly what this says. So, do not be friends with sinners. And that includes drunks. I know we call it alcoholism. The Bible would call it drunkenness. There's another proverb. Look at Proverbs 28, verse 7. Whoever keeps the law is a discerning son, but a companion of gluttons shames his father. Now this is the same idea, that you should not be friends with people who are drunks or gluttons. By the way, what's the underlying principle here? Self-control. They have no control, self-control, over what they drink or what they eat. So it might not be what they eat or drink. There might be some other area when they don't have self-control. Then that's when you say, put on the brakes. So this proverb says it. Proverbs 28, verse 7. Whoever keeps the law is discerning, but a companion who has no self-control, he brings a shame to his father. That's the kind of friend you don't want. So drunkenness and gluttony are the specifics mentioned in Proverbs, but clearly the underlying principle is self-control. So if you have a relationship with someone who does not have self-control, exit stage right. So don't be dumb, be discerning. That's what this proverb says. Anyone who keeps the law is discerning. Anyone who becomes a friend with somebody who doesn't have self-control is dumb. So don't be dumb, be discerning. Or look at another proverb. Look at Proverbs 4:14. He says, do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it. Do not travel on it. Turn away from it. Pass on. For they do not sleep unless they have done evil. And their sleep is taken away unless they make someone fall. And they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. Now this passage is saying the same kind of thing I've been saying for the last few minutes. And the basic idea of all these proverbs is don't become close friends with a sinner. Someone who is obviously sinning. Why not? Because it's going to lead to your destruction. Matter of fact, this passage says they don't sleep unless they've done evil. And they end up in violence, hurting and harming others, and you become like them. So, the minute they start influencing you, you have to consent not. How are we doing? We got it? The book of Proverbs is very clear. There are some people that should not be your friends. Fools, angry people, and sinners. So, why not? Because you will become like them. That could be it could be your own destruction. The Proverbs say that over and over again. It leads to your own destruction. I've been told that there is a species of alligator that is lazy. They seldom hunt for food. They wait for their food to come to them. Acting as though they are dead, they lie on the bank with their mouth open. Soon flies begin to light on the moistened tongue of the alligator. Other insects follow. Eventually, a lizard will crawl on the tongue to feed on the bugs. Then a frog joins the party. Once the crowd has assembled, the giant jaws slam together and the alligator enjoys his dinner. The point being, choose your friends carefully. Don't assemble with a group on the tongue of an alligator. Don't be close friends with sinners. All right, I said there were 4 types of people the book of Proverbs says you should not be friends with. I got one other. This one is really interesting. Look at Proverbs 24:21. Proverbs 24:21. My son, fear the Lord and the king. Now this is like saying fear the Lord and obey the government. Simple enough. Do not associate with those given to change, for their calamity will rise suddenly, and who knows the ruin those two can bring. Now, the little expression, given to change, is the key to these two verses. It is a common name for a particular class of people, those who are dissidents, oppositionists, revolutionaries, rebels. So if you meet somebody that is a rebel against God or a rebel against government, he says, that's headed for calamity. Get out of there. So you need to recognize rebels. Now, I could have put this under the category of sinners and had my 3 points. But I chose to make it separate because I think they are. This is almost like going a notch above. That some sinning is drinking, that's a little different than being a rebel. If you're associating with a rebel, that's a bad move. Don't be friends with rebels. Someone has said it refers to those who seek to set aside the worship of the true God or the authority of the true king who represents him. It is about those who are out to change divine institutions or overthrow civil government. Does that sound familiar? I'm reading Proverbs, not the paper. Have we seen anything like that recently? Are there people out there that want to overthrow the government in democratic America? And I wonder how many of those people who really understand what they're doing suck other young people into their orbit. And they go along with them thinking there's a good cause, and they are the ones destroying property and maybe even looting businesses. Don't go there. Don't be friends with that kind of person. If their intent is rebellion either against God or government, they're not a candidate for your friendship. They are troublemakers. By the way, somebody has suggested that these may be the kind of people that once in a while appear up in church because it says, fear the Lord. So maybe they knew about that and they rebelled against him anyway. So I just want to throw in the category of rebels. I want to read you a statement from a commentator that I found most interesting. He says, and I quote, "These men against whom we have here are warned are men of discontent, unsettled, factions, turbulent, revolutionary spirit, men who can be satisfied with nothing as it is, who with a mighty conceit of their own wisdom, talk and act as if they thought the world would never be right but under their domain, and boast of what a world would be could they but get all the ways they wanted." End of quote. That was written by a commentator in the 19th century. There's nothing new under the sun. All right, how are we doing? You got it? 4 kinds of people. Now, we're locking the doors, and the only way you can get out of here is you can tell me the 4 kinds of people. I'm kidding, of course. I just want to make sure you're listening. Number 1 is the fool. Number 2 is angry. Number 3 is sinners. And number 4 is rebels. Now, what I have not emphasized, but what's stated here is walk with the wise. Don't walk with the fools, the angry, the sinners, and the rebels. I want to conclude by making 2 simple observations. Number 1, walk with the wise. Matter of fact, one of the Proverbs said that. Walk with the wise. I think there was a time when we had movies and TV programs that exalted heroes more than we have now. Maybe one of the ways to do that is read biographies of people who are wise. But at any rate, walk with the wise. And obviously the second point is, don't walk with those who are going to lead you astray. Now Solomon taught that, and many years later, Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 15:33, evil company corrupts good habits. Write that one down. 1 Corinthians 15:33, evil company corrupts good manners. So, walk with the wise and don't become friends with fool, angry, sinning rebels. That's the message. Now, if you're a young person, or for that matter, any person, you could be 18 or 79, and you're friends with somebody, and your friends who know better warn you, they're doing you a favor. It seems to me that when young people especially start to associate with somebody they shouldn't, there's a warning. So I want to end by simply saying, listen to the warning. Because especially if you're a young person, you might not figure it out, but your parents will before you do. Then listen to the warning. Because those who are wiser warn their friends. So maybe that's a good note to end on. Don't wait till you figure it out. If somebody else is warning you, listen to the warning. Many studies have shown that animals and birds use different alarm calls for different predators. One group of monkeys, for example, have 3 distinct calls for leopards, snakes, and eagles. One author says, quote, "It is well known that monkeys and elephants are great friends. It is difficult to stalk an elephant because the monkeys in the treetops immediately sound the alarm when they catch a glimpse of a hunter unseen and unnoticed from the ground, but plainly visible from the treetops. The monkeys set up deafening screams to warn the eagles of the danger." End of quote. Then I found a piece that explains this. There is a tradition among some tribes in Africa that many years ago, as the result of a great drought, animals were faced with starvation. They were on one side of a river, but on the other side were springs of water and lush vegetation. As the drought and the famine increased with severity, the water in the river receded and became more and more shallow until the elephants could wade across to reach the rich fields on the other side. The last elephant was a cow with her calf at her side, and just as they were about to cross, she spied a mother monkey with her baby. The mother was so weak and emaciated that she could hardly walk. Finally, she fell down ready to die. With her trunk, the elephant gently lifted up the monkey and her baby, placing them on her back. Then she carried them across the river, which saved their lives. Even ever since then, the monkeys have acted as sentinels for the elephants to warn them of approaching danger. Now that legend is fiction, but the lesson is real. Friends warn their friends. So give the warning And if you're on the receiving end, listen to the warning. Father, thank you. Thank you for your insight, practical, down-to-earth insight in the book of Proverbs. And Lord, I pray that you will use this kind of information to help us not go down the road to self-destruction, but help us to walk with the wise and warn those who are about to walk with fools. In Jesus' name, amen.